on. Okay, everybody, I have the honor of presenting our speaker this evening, Jeff Antonelis-Lapp. After graduating from Huxley College, Western Washington University in 1978, excuse me, Jeff worked 2 summers at Mount Rainier National Park, igniting his connection to the mountain that endures today. He has summited the mountain, hiked all of its map trails, and completed the 93-mile Wonderland Trail 5 times. Pretty impressive. Jeff began writing Tahoma and its people after being unable to find a current natural history for a course he planned to teach in Evergreen State College in Olympia. He conducted over 250 days of field work for the book, many of them in the company of park archaeologists, biologists, and geologists. While at Evergreen, he taught Native American studies, natural history, environmental education, and served as the library dean before retiring in 2015. Jeff, thank you so much for speaking to us this evening, and please help me welcome Jeff.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Good evening. It's great to be with you. Really good to be doing this with you together. Thank you, Lynn, for reaching out and asking me to participate in your meeting tonight. Special congratulations to Jamie for the Kingfisher Award. Winning that sounds like some pretty interesting work that you're doing. And also to our student scholars and the scholarships that you took home tonight. That's really warms my heart and makes me have a lot of hope that there's a lot of good going on in the world, and you folks are part of that. So it's really great to be doing that. I've got a lot of good images. I've got a lot of pictures to share with you tonight. So why don't we dig in and get started, okay? I'm going to share my screen. You don't need to do anything except hopefully enjoy yourself. I do have a few audio clips to share. You might be able to hear them. If you can't, it's not a deal breaker, okay? So I'm assuming that you can see this first slide.
Yes, Jeff, we're good.
All right, and any kind of feedback that you want to give me throughout, if you lose me or we lose each other, just talk to me so I know. I've had the experience of talking to myself on Zoom presentations before, so it's kind of freaky. So again, thank you for having me be here, folks. Let's go ahead and get started. All of the stories I'm going to tell you tonight are from A Natural History of Mount Rainier National Park, a book called Tahoma and Its People that I wrote, and it was published by the Washington State University Press in 2020. Many of you are familiar with the word Tahoma and know that it's one of several Native American names for the mountain. And because I had worked in Indian country, on Indian reservations, had spent much time on the mountain with Native people, it just seemed very appropriate to me to use one of the most common names, Native names of the mountain in the title of the book. This is a view from the Nisqually Prairie, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. In fact, one of our birds that we're going to study tonight inhabits the Nisqually Prairie. I like to get warmed up with birders, and I'm assuming that many of you or most of you are bird watchers. And what do we do when we walk from the house to the car? We bird, right? When we walk from the car into the supermarket, we notice the osprey that's flying overhead the thriftway. So let's get warmed up by looking at some common birds. So we're going to cast a pretty broad net here. Look at just some of the common birds and do it in kind of a quiz-like fashion so that you have an opportunity to kind of get your brain sharpened up. So let's see if we can get started. Well, we're going to talk about the special birds of Mount Rainier, and I thought when I was preparing this, we could also call this presentation Shooting Owls, Kidnapping Eggs, and Birds Flying 100 Miles an Hour, because actually I'm going to talk about all those things, and all those things are true in tonight's presentation, but I didn't want to put anybody off at the beginning, so let's just stick with that title. And here's our first bird to warm up with, one of the common corvids in subalpine and alpine areas, Mount Rainier National Park and elsewhere. And if you've camped just anywhere in the West above a couple thousand feet, you probably have come in contact with what we've called the gray jay forever, right? And now known as the Canada jay. And it figures into one of the stories later tonight when I talk a little bit about predation on one of our target birds. You're probably familiar with many of the chickadees. I had black-capped and chestnut-backed chickadees at my feeder today, and I've only ever had one or two mountain chickadees at my feeder. But these are, for me, a common but not so easy to see bird. I don't see mountain chickadees every time that I'm up at the mountain. I always see the Canada jays, also known, of course, to a lot of non-birders as camp robbers, right? All right, let's take a look at a few more. Here's one of the earliest returners to the high country every spring. Comes back and begins nesting earlier than most of the other birds. And, well, it's blue and it's a bird and it loves the mountains. And yes, it is exactly that, a mountain bluebird. This next bird has a little bit of audio with it. You may not hear it. It's not very loud. If you don't hear it, I don't think it's going to be a deal breaker. So let's look at the video of it, the picture of it. And for many, many years, we called this a blue grouse. And when it was split into two species, and now more coastal Pacific side, known as the sooty grouse, and the inland bird, of course, I believe is the dusky grouse. This photo was taken by a student intern of mine at Mount Rainier a couple of years ago. And boy, did he get a good photo. Last one of the simple birds, the kind of the more common birds, also called camp robbers by folks that don't know any better. You and I know this as Clark's nutcracker. And interestingly, this photo is exactly where it should be of a nutcracker in a whitebark pine tree. And I could do entire presentations, entire papers, and even books have been written about the ecological relationship between Clark's nutcracker and whitebark pine. And whitebark pine are also in trouble in the high country. And so that's going to really have some long-term effects in terms of the alpine areas where whitebark pine is found. But we'll just leave it simple, keep it simple there for tonight, and keep moving into now. We're going to look at three birds that are I guess target birds that people will travel a long ways. And I've gotten many phone calls over the years, people asking me if I can help them find these birds. So we started with some very common. Now we're narrowing it down a little bit. And here are three birds of great interest at Mount Rainier. This is one of the toughest customers on the block. The gray-crowned rosy finch is able to endure some of the harshest weather and climatic conditions of all the birds that we have in the West. High altitude, if you ever hike up to Camp Muir or any of the high country in the Cascades, you've got an opportunity in the summertime to see the gray-crowned. Another bird of great interest to out-of-staters, of course, doesn't really look like it has a white tail exactly in this photograph, but the white-tailed ptarmigan. And it's been in the news a bit in the last couple of years with its diminishing numbers at Mount Rainier and questions as to whether or not it might gain some protective status. And finally, and this is the only bird here so far that I have not seen within park boundaries at Mount Rainier. Here's Jamie, I hope you can hear that, being an owler yourself, and I know you know what this is.
Sounds like one that we just thought it was an owl.
And of course, a boreal owl.
Well, yeah.
I've got a little outside noise here. I hope that's not bothering you folks, and I hope it goes away in a minute. So now we're going to dig into the three birds that we're really here for, the special birds of Mount Rainier. Each of these three species are protected under the U.S. Endangered Species Act Each of them are listed as threatened currently. And each of them has really intriguing stories and a lot of similarities between the three birds. And you'll see as we move along, you'll see what some of those threads are that tie these birds together. So I'm going to start with an audio clue to get you started on the first bird, the first special bird of tonight's talk. Here's the audio. Let's do that one more time. Tell the folks what the bird is, Jamie. Tell the folks. Let's take a look. All right. Is it A, woodsy owl? Is it B, a northern spotted? Is it a great gray owl? Or D, a barred owl? You're right. It's the northern spotted owl. It's the furthest northern spotted owl subspecies that we have in the West, located furthest north geographically. Here's a pair. The adults mate for life. They are non-migratory. They don't build nests. They hang out. Usually they nest in the top of a tree, maybe in a break-off, maybe in an abandoned bird of prey's nest or something like that. These owlets are probably a few weeks old, and it's probably somewhere between July and August on the calendar. You also know probably where these birds nest, primarily mature and old growth forests. I think mature is called 75 years to maybe 150 years old, and old growth is maybe 150 or 200 years and older. Anyway, we're talking about some big specimens where these birds nest primarily. And they feed, in our region, they feed almost entirely on northern flying squirrels, and a huge feeding area of about 25,000 acres. And if you want to get in your head, what does that look like? It would be like 2 Olympia Washingtons side by side. That would be about 25,000 acres. So if you want to imagine a grocery store as big as 2 Olympias, and the only thing on the shelves is northern flying squirrels, well, then you know that you're in the neighborhood of a northern spotted owl. These birds, of course, a huge victory was won by environmentalists and scientists when this bird was listed in 1990. And what I'd like to segue into now is a little bit of a long-term a little bit about a long-term population study, and ask you to come with me on kind of a virtual field trip into Mount Rainier, where we're going to see if we can track some spotted owls and maybe do some banding. For many years, there have been a number of study sites up and down the West, about 35 locations where researchers go out at least 3 times a season to see if they can locate spotted owls. And they're looking to see, are they paired, or are they single? Are they having young? If so, what's the age and condition of the young? Those sorts of things. So if they can find the birds, they'll often try to net them or noose them, as you'll see here in a minute, and then to get the data before they release the birds, and also band them as well. So our goal, the holy grail, what we're searching for tonight, is if we can get something like this to happen. So obviously, excuse me for just a minute, I'm going to close a window or two. I'll be right back. All right. All right, I'm back. So this is not a native mouse. This is a lab mouse that is raised in the mouse house at Mount Rainier. And when the researchers go out to do a survey, they'll take a handful of these mice, put them in an aerated container, a plastic container with holes in it, chuck it into somebody's day pack and carry it out. The other thing that they'll take with them, besides their lunches and snacks and water and rain gear, the other thing they'll take with them in their notepads is a device that can play back the call of the northern spotted owl. So an MP3 player or something that will play northern spotted owl calls. And the idea is we're going to go out off trail into some known territory of spotted owls, and we're going to start playing the recordings. And if and when we hear a call back, the idea is we're going to run like crazy people toward the direction of where that sound came from. And if we get lucky enough to find a bird, as was done here, this I believe was in the Ohanapakash area some years ago. If we get lucky enough, what the newest person on the crew, that would have been me, gets to hold the stick on which that mouse is perched on the end of the stick, and you get the experience of having an adult spotted owl come flying straight at you with its talons out. And what it does is it snatches up that first mouse, takes it to a roost, and gobbles it down. We put a second mouse on the stick, nervously hold it, and the owl comes back, and this time the idea is that it's going to lead us to its young. And lo and behold, on this particular day, our dreams came true. You'll see here owlet number 1. You see owlet number 2, if you can see my little pointer. And Keith is the fellow here at the base of the pole and noose device. And he's in the process of very gently capturing this first owl so that we can band it, take some measurements, and set it free. I think you might even be able to see the band, the pink band here on its leg. And both of these owls are kept, in human contact for, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes, not a very long time. There's a whole series of measurements that take place. These birds, as you may know, are pretty tame, pretty approachable, pretty inquisitive. They don't freak out, when they're in the hands of humans like this. So here's the other bird about to launch. And then the birds are set free. And the crew spends the rest of their time munching their snacks and compiling their data and making any kind of anecdotal notes that they think would be helpful down the line. So what I'd like to share with you is the results of some of these studies. If we look in the left-hand side of this grid, this table, this is the population size, and when the study started, however many birds they found at Olympic, at Mount Rainier, that's the yellow square that we're really going to focus on, and at Cle Elum, the triangle, however many birds they found when they began at year 1, that was 100% of the population. And if you can follow Mount Rainier's population drop over the next 20 years, and see down here is years of monitoring across the bottom. Over the next 20 years, there was a 60% decline at Mount Rainier of northern spotted owls. And this is a trend that is region-wide. All populations that we're aware of are at high risk. And obviously, the next question is, what the heck? If they've been protected under the Endangered Species Act, why the decline? If we've stopped some of the habitat loss, what's going on? Well, still loss of old growth habitat over 1.6 million acres in about a 20-year period. And that added up to over 12%, almost 13% of the available forest habitat in those 3 states. Okay. Equally important, maybe more important to some researchers, is that what's happened in the last 20 years is an interloper has entered the game and has really been a game changer. And what is that? Like I know, that is the barred owl. And the barred owl in this case is kind of like a super predator. They are 20% larger than northerns. Their range has expanded in the last century from the eastern United States across boreal Canada and the northern United States. A couple theories on why that's happened, why they've expanded their range, but now they're in the same area that northern spotted owls are found. They're adaptable to a wide variety of habitats. They have a wide-ranging diet. They have reproductive advantages that include more young, that grow faster and mature sooner. So all of these things has really been a double whammy for the northern spotted owl in terms of being outcompeted for prime habitat by the barred owl. No kidding. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service saw this data, took a look at the numbers the declining numbers of spotted owls. It took them about 7 years of hand-wringing and debating to decide what to do. And what they decided to do was to start a pilot program. Let's remove barred owls from a couple of areas and see if that has any effect on the spotted owl populations. So they started a removal program, and I will tell you straight out, with a 12-gauge shotgun, removing barred owls from known areas. And where they started, the pilot program was in the redwoods. And what they found there, researchers found that shortly after barred owls were removed, northern spotteds came right back into their old habitat. They came back. And so that encouraged researchers to broaden the pilot program to 3 locations. And here's a map of that. So we're going to take a quick look at an area outside of Clay Elum, one on the what's called the Coast Range, and one down in the Klamath area. If you're looking at the map, the pinkish polygons are areas where birds were removed from, barred owls were removed from. If you're looking at the blue polygons, those are areas for comparison where they're controlled, no birds were removed from there. And what did they find? Well, after they had removed a couple thousand barred owls, which actually, I just read it, it amounts to a very small percentage of the entire range of the barred owls. 2,000 owls is a lot of owls, but it was less than, it wasn't even 1%, it was less than 0.5% of their range, not the total number, but of the range that barred owls are found in. Anyway, what they found was, and let's just focus for the sake of ease here, let's just focus on the blue bars. Okay, that's Clay Elum. Down across the bottom is an NB non-breeding season, 2015 and 16. It looks like researchers took out about 120 or 125 barred owls. And the next year, it looks like they took out close to maybe 80 or 85. I don't have the exact numbers. In the breeding season, that's BR, they did not take any out. And as you can see, as we carry on non-breeding in 17 and 18, they took out close to 100. They took out over 125 in the next non-breeding season of 18 and 19. And in the breeding season of 19, they took out about 50. Okay, now let's take a look at these numbers. What does that mean? How does that work out? Here are the results of those removals from this 5-year period. In the control areas, that is where they did not remove bards, spotteds continued to decline in pairs by 83%. 83% decline. And in the treatment area where they removed bards, the spotted owl pairs increased by 12%. So a pretty stark difference between the control area and the treatment area. Okay. So what does that mean long term? What are we looking at? What do we think? Well, the Wildlife Service, Fish and Wildlife, is planning to continue the removals, possibly up to that number, 3,600. To see if there's a chance that they can get a handle on the barred owls, and longer term what happens, and if spotteds come back into an area, will they stay there? There's also been some question as to whether or not changing the listing from threatened to endangered would provide added protections for the spotted owls. I don't know what the status of that is. I don't see anything in the news that pertains to that. But those are a couple of things that we have to think about in terms of the future of the spotted owl. And as I said, regionally, they're in trouble all over. So whatever, researchers can do to get more answers to questions is going to probably help in the longer term. So I think, yeah, let's move on to our second bird. So this was the first special bird of Mount Rainier, the northern spotted owl. And let's move on to the second bird, a quirky little bugger. Usually seen on the water. So tell me who this is. I'll give you multiple choice. Must be a great auk. Cassin's auklet, marbled murrelet, pigeon guillemot. What do you think? You're right. You're right about marbled murrelet. Brachyramphus marmoratus. Brachyramphus, I think, means curved beak. And marmoratus is, I think, Latin for marbled, and that kind of that look that you get more in the when they're brown. Is that the non-breeding season? I think. Anyway, I'm a little rusty on those guys. But usually when I've seen the birds, I've seen them on the water, like this at a distance, or flying away from me, or better yet, how many times have I gotten my glasses up to my face and they immediately dive? You ever have that happen to you? About 1,000 times? Yeah, we're brothers and sisters in that way. But two birds on the water are worth one bird in the hand. And here's a researcher holding a marble murrelet. They are about the size of a tiny Nerf football. They're also about the size and weight and shape of a papaya. Now, their remains have been found in archaeological digs, and so suggesting that these birds have been part of the diet of Native Americans going back hundreds or maybe thousands of years. You know, for me, I'm a pretty traditional eater. I would probably prefer to eat a papaya over a murrelet. But if I was going to bet on who's going to win the race between the two, these little guys can fly. They've actually been clocked at 100 miles an hour, marble murrelets, and they can average anywhere between 45 and 80 miles an hour. Their wings are proportionately long and slender and kind of scythe-shaped, and they're really fast wing beats, and they can book. And that's really important because in just a minute, you're going to see some of the distances that these birds travel to feed their young. They're wild. They are a member of the alcid family, so related to the puffins, murres, those kind of birds, the auklets, related to those, the other murrelets. They have the distinction of being the last nest found in North America. We knew where the other 700 odd nests were, where these other birds had located their nests. And this was such a mystery for such a long time to scientists and bird watchers that in the 1970s, the National Audubon Society actually started offering a cash prize for the first known documented nest of the marbled murrelet. And it wasn't until 1974, way up in a Douglas fir tree in a state park in California, when a tree surgeon, I think about 150 feet up a tree surgeon and a nestling marble murrelet, they probably scared the heck out of each other. Who got the worst end of it was the murrelet. It tumbled out of the tree and died the next day. But this was the record of the first time that we knew of the nest sites of marble murrelets. Most of these alcids, of course, nest near the sea, rocky habitat, on cliffs, those sorts of things. So far as we know, this is the only, so far as I know, this is the only old growth forest nesting alcid. Here's their range, again, with the little pointer, way up into the Aleutians, all the way down through BC, Washington, Oregon, and most of the way down through California, okay? If we zoom in and we look at their breeding season occurrences, so each dot represents where these birds have been seen or heard during the breeding season. Well, if they hang out in saltwater, we would expect them to be along here, right? We would expect them at the Strait of Juan de Fuca. We would expect them here on the outer coast. But when we look at all these sightings inland, you've got to ask yourself, what is going on? Isn't that wild? What the heck? Well, and here we go again, because now we know that these birds nest in old growth forests. And at Mount Rainier, the main place that these birds are found is in the Carbon River Valley, which is a mere 47 miles from Puget Sound. So if you can imagine a commute just to eat, just to find food, 47 miles, and up the Carbon River Road, kind of in the Falls Creek area, is where I've done all of my research, my field work for listening for marbled murrelets. I have not seen a marbled murrelet in an old growth forest, and not many people do. Fewer than 20% of the sightings of murrelets during the breeding season are audio. People hear the birds. That's because these birds are cryptically colored. They are nest solitarily, not in large groups. They are super fast, easy to miss. They're flying around before sunrise, so the periods of low light, they're really hard to see. And they don't build a nest, but like you see here, they find a hollowed out spot on a large limb in this region, usually on a Douglas fir, usually close to the trunk, usually most of the way up the tree, and often very close to water, in this case, the Carbon River. The female lays one egg. It's incubated for about 28 days by both parents. They both develop a brood patch, and many of you are familiar with the brood patch. It's the unfeathered area that a bird develops during the breeding season, where the blood vessels, it's basically the best heating and air conditioning unit that you could think of. It allows the birds to keep just the perfect temperature on the egg that they're incubating. And the parents work in 24-hour shifts. One bird is almost motionless the entire 24 hours on the egg, while the other bird is down in Puget Sound feeding and rooting around and doing whatever murrelets do during the day. And then they switch off and they trade off the next morning before dawn. And the other bird goes out to feed, and the bird coming back settles in and incubates the egg for another 24 hours. When the bird hatches, it's alert. They're precocial, so it's downy. They're kind of with it. They're still really subject to predation and falling out of the nest for the first week. They only have one egg, one young. And please make sure to ask me what happens when they go to fledge, because it's a crazy story. I need to keep moving with the rest of their story, but what that young bird has to go through just to get to water its first time without a training flight is really, really amazing. So I hope we get to talk about that when we get to the Q&A session. So as I mentioned, hard to see, pretty cryptic. Most all the observations, as I mentioned, are by audio. Look at, is there a bird in that picture? Yeah, maybe. There's your helper. And here's what we listen for. And if your audio isn't great, I apologize. It's a kind of a gull like here that you're listening for that would tell you that you're within range or you're within sight of a marbled murrelet. Here it is. So that's what we're listening for. We're up there, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning in July, up there early. Got a thermos in one hand, sitting in the camp chair next to the river, listening very intently, and hardly would ever see a bird. In fact, like I said, I've never seen one in the breeding season, seen them on the water in winter. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes as to why most of you are not seeing very many of them these days. Even with all this going for them, these adaptations of cryptic coloring and being solitary and hard to find and hard to see, they are still quite subject to predation. And in fact, about 3/4 of the failed nesting attempts are because of predators. So the Canada jay that we opened the show with, Steller's jay, the other corvids, particularly crow and raven, are among the perpetrators to take either eggs or young or even adults if they get the opportunity. And of course, we know them to be opportunistic. In some California areas, recreation areas, they've adopted a slogan to use with visitors that says, feed a jay, kill a murrelet, trying to get people to understand that feeding the other birds brings them into the area and attracts them, and being curious, they're likely to find any murrelets that are nesting in the area. So let's wrap up bird number 2, special bird number 2. What do we know? Again, as with the spotted owl, a substantial loss of nesting habitat over a 20-year period, recorded at about 20%. Even though these birds spend 95% of their lives on the water and 5% on land, that 5% is their breeding season. So that's super important. So that loss of nesting habitat is really crucial. Here's one thing I really like to mention, especially to groups with birders and you folks that have opportunities to bird on the water. A decline, an on-water survey of marble murrelets ongoing for 16 years found a 44% decline in the marble murrelet population. And so if you're like me, a long-term birder, and you think, gosh, we don't see marbled murrelets in winter much anymore. Well, there's a reason for that. There aren't as many. They're doing a little better in Oregon and California. They've dropped off by 70% in Alaska, where there's still a gajillion of them, but their population has fallen drastically in Alaska. But the drop in Washington has been linked by some researchers to the loss of nesting habitat. And to such an extent that the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife, recommends they're state listed as threatened. So they're also nationally, federally listed as threatened. The state Fish and Wildlife has suggested that they get status as endangered at the state level. That would add additional protections. If you're eagle-eyed, you might notice a band on that bird. I'm not super sure, but I wonder if that's an aluminum bracelet that that bird has on it. So to wrap it up, what would help? Well, some folks think that if landowners would work a little harder to preserve and improve their habitat, and if they had a tax break, some kind of incentive, we would get beyond just the little edgy, the little habitat that's mostly edge, and people would maybe be more mindful to preserve larger tracts of land that would be good habitat for the marbled murrelet. Some researchers are working to figure out whether or not they'll nest in second growth forests. Not sure. And finally, what will the effect of climate change have on this situation? As ocean waters continue to warm, what effect is that going to have on the forage fish, the sand lance, herring, and anchovy? Oh, and I forgot to mention, by the way, that in terms of mileage, when that young bird has hatched, both parents feed the bird, and the bird is fed anywhere between 1 and 8 times per day. So if you can imagine, what's going on is each parent is flying from the carbon sites. And again, we haven't found any sites there, but the presence of the birds every summer indicates that there's probably a nest site there. 47 miles from that area where I've located marbled murrelets, 47 miles down to Puget Sound and back. So you're talking about a 94-mile round trip, coming back with just one fish, okay, like picture an anchovy or a sand lance across its bill, crossways, kind of like I don't know, like a fish Manchu or something, right? Brings back one fish, feeds the young bird, turns around and flies back. So these birds can fly hundreds of miles in a single day, and at the speed that they're flying, they can make a one-way trip in what, an hour or less? Get a fish, bring it back to the nest, feed the young, and go back. From 1 to 8 times a day, that youngin is fed. So I think is that the last? Yeah, that's the last one on the marbled murrelet. So what effects of climate change are going to have on forage fish and the relationship between this bird and what it eats. So that wraps up our second special bird. So we talked about the northern spotted owl, talked about the marbled murrelet, and now I have to make a confession to all of you. And the confession is that bird number 3 does not actually reside within the boundaries of Mount Rainier National Park. Subspecies, its first cousins do, but the bird that we're going to talk about is actually found on the Nisqually prairies. And another interesting story that does have to do with habitat loss, and also some really good stories of gain and reclamation in birds making a comeback. So let's get to that one. We're looking at Mount Rainier, as you can see through the haze in the background. We're looking at probably lots of camas here in the foreground. It would be springtime on the Nisqually prairies. And your first guess is, that must be angry bird. Well, it certainly looks like it, doesn't it? A pipit, western meadowlark, or hornlark. Check out those fancy bracelets. Look at those. Isn't that neat? Got 3 different ones. I'm going to introduce you to the rock star of this project, in a few minutes, and he has multiple, it is a male, he has multiple bracelets on his legs as well. It's a bird. All right, horned lark, let's take a look. Streaked horned lark, Eremophila alpestra strigata, strigata meaning streaked. This is one of the 24 subspecies. I pray to heaven that they never break these down into separate species. It's going to drive us crazy. 24 subspecies of horned lark. And I see horned lark up on the mountain all the time, particularly on the sunrise side of the mountain. In the summertime, July and August, all the time. But this is a subspecies called the streaked horned lark, which is a prairie bird. And this native prairie, I didn't know this until about 15 or 20 years ago, that where native prairie once stretched all the way from Vancouver Island, all the way through Washington, roughly along the footprint of I-5 and east of there a little bit, all the way into Oregon down to the Willamette Valley. And what remains today is just a very small percentage. And some of the finest habitat, prairie habitat, oak prairie habitat ecosystem that remains is at Joint Base Lewis McChord. And that's the big Army Air Force base that's between Tacoma and Olympia. Many of you are familiar with where that is. And that happens to be the focal point for for the horned lark restoration projects. And we're going to take a little virtual field trip there in just a few minutes. So as you know, and as you can imagine, habitat loss. So the prairies have lost 97% of habitat. And you know then what that's going to mean is it's going to be a drop in biodiversity. The last time that I knew, over 45 or 46 species of plants, prairie plants, were on various target lists, watch lists at the state and federal level. About half of the bird species that were associated with the prairies had either had their range reduced or had a population drop. So really drastic, substantial drop in biodiversity because of the loss of the prairies, loss of habitat. So historically, the dark polygons represent where researchers think that streaked horned larks were found. This would be the southernmost tip of Vancouver Island. This would be Bellingham-ish. This would be the Puget Trough. We're going to take a field trip in a minute right into here, South Puget Sound. Some question as to whether or not there were lark populations out on the coast, and then pretty sure they were along the Columbia and then down into the Willamette Valley. So where they are now, the purple dots represent the sites of known streaked horned larks nesting sites. Here's a handful that we're going to visit. Here's a couple out on the coast, and then a few down along the Columbia. Okay. So where we're going to go is actually to Joint Base Lewis McChord, aka JBLM, and known to some people as Jablam, JBLM, get it? And what I want you to look at are the black polygons. These are where there are lark study sites. So we found streaked horned larks and they're under study there. So there's a handful at Joint Base Lewis McChord. That's the yellow polygon, is all JBLM. So there's a handful here. There's also a study site at the Olympia Airport and at Shelton at the Sanderson Airport. Okay. We can't go to, we really shouldn't go to any of these sites. And that's why we're going to go there virtually. So let's imagine that we're out on the prairies. Okay, everybody, find that streaked horned lark. Can you see it? Well, I don't know, Jeff. I see some grasses. I just can't see much. Okay, let's get a helper here. Closing up. Can you see them now? All right. So very cryptically colored. Ground nester, great idea. Ground nesting in the prairie. I don't quite get that. And they are susceptible to predation from western meadowlarks, harriers, northern harriers, garter snakes, coyotes. All of those love omelets, or they love the young, love the chicks. But because they're cryptically colored, they probably have a fighting chance of survival into adulthood. Why does this researcher look so frumpy? Why is he so unhappy? Well, let's look closer at what Adam has in his hands. And he has a predated nest. And when one egg is predated like that, you see it broken open? You can see the yolk. When it's broken open, it's going to be abandoned by the parents. So the predation rate, was natural and disturbing. But what was even more disturbing to researchers was they found that these birds had a low hatch rate and a low fledging rate. That is, not as many eggs hatched as they would have expected in other populations, and not as many birds reached adulthood, and that is migrating into the adult population, fledging and becoming adults as in other populations. So what they suspected was inbreeding, and they suspected that there was a lack of genetic diversity among this population of birds. So they hatched an idea, hatched an idea, and they called it a genetic rescue project. And really, that's just fancy language. That's just a euphemism for a dastardly kidnapping plot. Because what they cooked up was they found a healthy population of streaked horned larks down at the airport in Corvallis, Oregon. They got in cahoots with the researchers down there. And when the conditions were perfect in the summertime, a researcher from JBLM would drive down in the early morning down to the Corvallis airport, basically pick up a clutch of eggs, the full nest and the eggs, not the parents, a clutch of eggs, put it in an incubator, drive it back to Joint Base Lewis McChord, and put it where there was either a pair or, in a good location, hoping that a mated pair would adopt and raise these birds to which they were not biologically related. And by gum, it worked. Now, before you wonder, well, what about the birds that just lost their eggs? What about the ones that had their clutch stolen from them? The good news is that these birds will re-nest several times in a season. So one time you can get away with it pretty easily, get it early enough in the season, steal their eggs, don't steal them again, let them re-nest, and they can have another clutch of their own eggs. So that seems to work out pretty good. So that is not a pan of lasagna, my friends. That is basically a clutch of eggs that is getting translocated, if you will, onto JBLM. And if things have gone perfect, it's a plug-in incubator that you plug into the ashtray slot in the car. If things have gone perfectly, that's what you get. And then researchers carefully take that nest and put it out into the prairie near a mated pair, hoping that they will take it on. And they do. So this is called Count the Chicks. This was a super productive female, not the eggs in the nest that we just saw, but super productive. See how many beaks you can find in this picture. 2, 3, 4, 5. I think there's one more. 6. And I think the average clutch size is 3 to 5. So she really outdid herself with this group. As we wrap this up, I want to introduce you to Brian. And as I said, he's the rock star of the whole operation, and he's got 4 different bands to prove it. He was the first streaked horned lark. He was the first egg that was translocated from Corvallis up to JBLM, incubated and hatched, migrated. They migrate, so he left, in early fall, came back the next year to JBLM, and has returned several seasons to breed. So there's a perfect classic example of increasing the genetic diversity by introducing a genetic strand from elsewhere into the population at Joint Base Lewis McChord. So that's a real win. And there's some more wins here with the streaked horned larks, and here they are. This is my good friend Adrian holding a chick. Notice the cool pin feathers. The primaries and secondaries are still in pin feather phase. Pretty neat. One of the things they started doing that really made a huge difference is they got people on the ground with GPS walking and finding nests and locating the locations on a GPS, and then sharing that information with airfield managers or with people that do the mowing at Joint Base Lewis McChord. And once they got in cooperation with each other, that really reduced a lot of the direct impacts to such a degree that the number of pairs of streaked horned larks skyrocketed. So in a little over 10 years, a 6-fold increase at McChord Field from 8 to 50 pairs. That's pretty good news when you've got a bird that was really struggling to make it. Also on the native prairie there, an increase from 12 to 40 pairs since 2011. And that's just partly because of that surveying on the ground to find nest sites. Now, the bad news is off base at Olympia, when I put this together a couple years ago, at least at that time, off base, there were no conservation measures that were going on like what's going on at JBLM. So there were still decreasing numbers at Olympia and the Shelton airports. Now, and I haven't never seen anything in the news to indicate that they made a change there. But at one point I heard that the Department of Fish and Wildlife was going to attempt to intervene and to interface with the airport managers at each of those locations to get them to see if they could do some on the ground monitoring, find nests, and then have the mowing regimes changed. So let's wrap it up, and let's wrap it up with a few questions just to give you a chance to kind of land on some of the main ideas, okay? A couple of questions on northern spotted owls. This is a true false, I believe. They're declining at Mount Rainier, but are doing well in other portions of their range. Is that true or false? Bad news is that's false. Number two, the two key factors in their decline are A, loss of old growth habitat, B, poaching by hunters, C, competition from barred owls, D, a lack of prey. Pick two of those that you think are the key in the decline. And that would be A, loss of old growth, and competition from barred owls. All right, let's get a couple of questions on the murrelets. This is going to be a true false. Appear to be the only alcid that nests in old growth forests. Near as I can tell, and if you know differently, email me and turn me on to the other information that might contradict this. But so far as I know, they're the only one that nests in old growth forests. And numbers could improve with two developments. This again is multiple choice. Breeding programs that train the birds to have larger clutches. Can you imagine? Landowners can be persuaded to preserve habitat. C, predator removal programs begin and succeed. And D, they can adapt to nesting in second growth forests. Think of the two things that we talked about that would possibly could help improve their numbers. That would be B, landowners preserving habitat with an incentive, of course, and murrelets adapting to nesting in second growth forests. And finally, a couple of horned lark questions. True, false, they are just one of many prairie bird species impacted by habitat loss. True or false? That is true. And finally, the multiple choice. All of these factors contribute to the lark's recovery except one, and it is A, increasing the frequency of mowing, B, the Oregon Nest Translocation Project, C, nest finding and other conservation measures, D, communicating nest locations to airfield managers. All but one, and that is the increasing the frequency of mowing. All the others are aiding the recovery of the lark. So if you're interested in Tahoma and its people, books are available, through your independent bookseller. That's the way I suggest people get them. Keep it local, or you can get it online. And I also want you to know that I have a couple of other talks, and especially one that I wanted to share with you tonight, just in case you might want to have me back sometime. It's called Tahoma's Biggest Stories. And what I do is I handle just two, what I think are two of the biggest stories around Mount Rainier. One is the presence of Native people at the mountain that goes back over 9,000 7,000 years. And that projectile point right there probably is about 7,000 years old. And the other big story are the catastrophic effects of climate change at the mountain that go way beyond the retreating glaciers, which most of us are very familiar with that idea, but there are lots of cascading effects of that. And I have a similar talk to tonight's talk with lots of good images to really keep things moving. So with that, I'm going to stop my share of my screen. I'm going to come up for air, and I'll be happy to take questions if we have time for questions.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff. Let's go ahead and give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
So what we'll do here is we'll start in the room first. If anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I'll come over with the microphone. And then for those folks that are on Zoom, if you're thinking of questions, put them in the chat and Jeff could see those and possibly answer. So
Yeah, that
got a
could work.
question right here from Mike.
You mentioned earlier that you could encourage landowners to enhance habitat for murrelets and the spotted owl, I think. How would you enhance your habitat to make them more friendly?
I think what I have read is that what that means is basically being more selective in what you cut and trying to preserve mature or old growth forests. And this would be not just landowners, but this would be, commercial developments, commercial companies, and preserving larger tracts. One of the problems is to preserve a small area of mature or old growth. It's very what they call edgy. It just has a lot of edge to it, and not a lot of depth to the stand. And so, if people could be more strategic in what it is that they logged out, that might make a difference. That's what I meant.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Jeff, you also said that you might want to talk a little bit about how that young murrelet makes it back to the saltwater.
No wonder these guys are in trouble. I mean, they are the craziest bird. I'm going to set up house and live 95 miles from the grocery store. And when I'm raising a kid, I'm going to have to make the trip, 3, 4, 5 times a day. So that's pretty wild. Single bird, single egg, one nestling around the end of the first month. If it hasn't been predated upon, if it hasn't fallen out of the nest, it gets ready to fly. It's never flown before, of course. It flaps its wings. It's picking out all of its natal plumage. It's growing in its flight feathers. And finally, it just gets the nudge from nature. And it's usually at dusk. And it's usually about a month old. And so now it's going to set off doing something it's never done before. That is fly. Going somewhere it's never been. That is to the ocean. Doing something it's never done, and that is learning to fend for itself. So they literally fall out of the nest, flapping their wings, and on a wing, literally a wing and probably a prayer. They use the river and some creeks and some roads like a compass needle to direct them to the water. Isn't that a cool thing to think about, how they find that directionally? If you followed the river, if you followed the Carbon, you would run into the Puyallup. If you followed the Puyallup, you would end up in Commencement Bay. And if they're lucky, if they've survived all that, because if they flop, if they get exhausted and they hit land, they can't regain their altitude. They're done. So they have to fly all at once, the first time ever, that 47 miles in this case for the Carbon River birds. Some birds that nest further inland, it's even further than that. But they have to make the flight all in one fell swoop and get to the and without parents. The parents don't come with them. The parents don't greet them when they get into Puget Sound. They are essentially on their own to figure out how to feed and how to stay away from seals and bald eagles and western gulls and the other predators. So it's got to be a pretty harrowing experience. And the fact that there are any of them still existing, considering all the odds against the marbled murrelets, is really pretty remarkable. That's the story of the nestling, fledging, and getting to Puget Sound in this case.
Thanks, Jeff. Got a couple of questions here in the room, and once again on Zoom, if you want to put your question in the chat, Jeff can answer it.
You'll have to get closer. Okay. I just wanted to say, did you know that we have some habitat sitting here in Kitsap County that's just waiting for some marbled murrelet?
No, tell me more.
It's at Grover's Creek, right? At Great Peninsula Conservancy owns it, and it's called Grover's Creek. And it's a old growth spruce, is it? Or yeah, it has some old. Anyways, they're hoping to attract a couple.
I might have been there a time or two. Are there a number of walking trails there?
Not really.
No, okay, I might be mistaken with another place. Okay.
Yeah, so your friend Adrian Wolf works for Great Peninsula Conservancy.
Oh, good. I knew
And
he
so-
had switched, but I couldn't remember where he was now.
Yep.
Good, yeah. Be interesting to see if they do nest in those spruce, because everything I've read is that they really prefer Douglas fir in this region. Of course, not everywhere, but in this region that they prefer Doug fir. It would be interesting to see if they could, you know, branch out, literally.
Any other questions in the room?
I don't want to.
Okay.
I'm just curious about the barred owl, the issue with the spotted owl and it feeding on the flying squirrel. Has anybody done studies on the flying squirrel population? The glaucomies, have they increased by any expanse in the areas that the spotted owls are?
Oh, so I think what you're asking is, have the squirrel populations increased in areas where the spotted owls have decreased?
Right.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't have any data on that or know anything about that. But it would, unless areas where spotteds have been forced out and barred owls have come in, and barred owls have a very varied diet, maybe they continue to predate on the squirrels, but I don't know that. Yeah, thank you for that question. I like that. Well, there's nothing here in the chat. Anything else on the floor?
I've got one.
Oh, Kevin has one. Yeah, I was gonna say that property was purchased with the help of Audubon Society, the Grover's Creek property. We went out there in March, and while I was on that walk, I was talking to somebody who did marbled murrelet surveys, you know, a few years back, and she said it was during COVID. And it was miserable because of COVID, everyone was suddenly on their own instead of in pairs, and you had to wake up in the middle of the morning, like dawn, and just wait and see if they'd fly over. Well, GPC and they've been working with the North Kitsap High School Wildlife Club a little bit with audio moss. They had a couple of projects last year. These audio sensory devices where they're picking up bird song and then playing tracks and identifying what the birds are. I'm wondering if there is use of those types of devices for marbled murrelets so that people don't have to always be out there when they're trying to find these nests.
Yeah, excellent. And yes, murrelets do render a unique radar signature. So, you know, it's probably a matter of funding and then training to, you know, operate the radar equipment. And I've never used it. It's always been manual by me and a fellow birder. So I don't know, but I do know that radar has been used at Mount Rainier, and where they have found them in other watersheds. And there's 4 or 5 rivers at Mount Rainier where they have detected marbled murrelets, and I don't know if all of them have used radar, but I know that they have used radar at Mount Rainier. So I know that's a thing. I don't know much more about. I don't know anything else about it.
All right. Well, thanks so much. We appreciate you joining us, Jeff. Let's give another round of applause.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure. Really enjoyed doing it. Thanks for having me.
All right. And thanks again for everyone coming tonight and for those scholarship winners and for Jamie Acker for the Kingfisher Award.
Two pieces for folks that are here tonight. One, we have all sorts of awesome books over here and even a couple of coffee cups and birds on it that are there for you to pick up. They were bequeathed to us, and you are welcome to also drop up an optional donation. But we have so many books, guys.
Please
don't let that.
Enjoy them.
Yeah, yeah.
Take
And
them
the
and
second
enjoy
thing is scholarship recipients, if you don't mind getting together before you leave, it'd be great to have. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. We're closing the program. Good night.